There's obviously an enormous amount of enthusiasm about artificial intelligence. We're all here today. We're going to delve very deeply into specific industry verticals and topic areas in the course of the day. But today, we wanted to set the frame with a larger conversation in the morning. What do you think are really the practical, achievable goals of AI? Let's pick a time frame, 2030, that you think goes beyond the hype cycle.
Sure. So when I think of over the next 10 years, I think we'll see a pattern that we've seen before. You start off with novelty. You know, that first time you got an email, or the first time you got an email with a web address in it, and it was, what is this? And you start, and very quickly we go to necessity. We have got to have a global web presence. We've got to have a mobile global web presence. In the same way, we're going to see that pattern repeat. And eventually you get to ubiquity. After you sort of go through the hype cycle, it becomes enculturated. It becomes just something you account for. You just assume that, you know, I didn't even know I had to ask if you should be incorporating these technologies. And I think we're going to see that same thing here, that you'll start out when, and right now we're somewhere between novelty and perhaps a hype of necessity. We have got to understand this, and that's why we're having discussions like the one we're having today. But I think as we look forward in 10 years, we'll see this, you know, and the rubric itself is so broad, artificial intelligence, but pieces of this, pieces of the kind of cognitive faculties that today we depend on humans for, we'll see pieces of those implemented, and they will become ubiquitous. We'll just assume that, in much way my children assume, anything with a screen can be swiped or touched. We'll just assume that any product we have we'll enter into conversation with. We'll just assume that the information that's flowing off of our physical systems, our economic systems, it's just going to be, there's going to be a watcher. There's going to be something there that's going to be digesting that, extracting features, extracting information, and telling us the most relevant things that we need for our jobs. And I think that's really what we'll experience here, is that ubiquity, that it'll just be assumed that the systems that we have will have these capabilities, and we'll just get used to it. Now, I don't know that you'll see sort of the deep AI, the artificial consciousness. I think that's probably beyond. But this is a chaotic period. We're still doing these systems with electronics, with today's digital technologies, architectures that we inherited over the last 50 years, and they have remained relatively unchanged because there's been such tremendous progress. You know, depending upon if we can find some alternative technologies that really break through, then maybe we'll see some breakthroughs. But at least for right now, what I can predict is that we will see these technologies and they'll just become enculturated. We'll expect our systems to have at least the beginnings of this, the ability to find patterns, to extract features, and to always be telling us what's most relevant for us at any instant.
Anupam, let's see what your vision is for 2030. What's realistic, and what, if we get things right, if things go in the right direction, what's possible?
Right. So I think I echo some of Kirk's optimism.
Tell me where you differ.
Right. So
we always need a gloomy Gus, you know, on the panel. So
sure. I want to preface my comments by saying that I'm an AI optimist, and then let me step back and highlight areas where we may want to proceed with caution. So I think one of the biggest, to my mind, one of the biggest challenges is that we want to make sure that these AI systems are making the right predictions and decisions for the right reasons. And there is an emerging field around algorithmic accountability that is geared towards examining these questions. And the reason I think it's important is that there are domains in which we have seen amazing advances. And by 2030, ideally, these advances will translate into production systems that are mainstream. Healthcare is a good example, where these neural networks are now, in some studies, at par with radiologists in doing diagnosis from images. And there are other areas as well. But if these systems are not making the right decisions and predictions for the right reasons, then that has implications for a whole host of issues. One is performance. It will not generalize well. Maybe it works well for the set of examples on which it was initially tested. But then when new images come in with idiosyncratic features, which are different from the ones that the system was exposed to during training, then those radiology image classification systems may not perform as well. So for performance, it's important. For fairness, it's important. So we have seen plenty of examples in the recent past where studies have shown that these kinds of systems pick up on historical biases that are in the data on which they're trained. So the systems may end up being unfair to women, to certain races that have historically been disadvantaged. So for fairness, it's very important that we also answer this question. For safety and security. So here the examples are more adversarial, where there have been lots of demonstrations of attacks where a specially crafted set of inputs can fool a facial recognition system, for example, to think that this bearded man is Drew Barrymore.
Did I mention this is really Drew Barrymore?
Right. Or to think that a road sign, which is a stop sign really, but with a couple of stickers carefully placed, looks like a speed limit sign, right? And these have implications in settings where we are using these systems for security. Imagine a facial recognition system being used as part of a security system in an airport, or by 2020, we might have a virtual infrastructure of traffic signals and road signs, and if those could be manipulated to fool self-driving cars into thinking that stop signs are actually speed limit signs, the consequences can be quite disastrous.
So you highlight a couple of different things to watch out for. The last point you're making even opens the systems up to malicious actors, right? So to mischief or worse, criminal activity. I think that's something that certainly companies need to be on watch for, and they have a self-interest in guarding against that. They would invest in. But the earlier point you made, I think, in a sense, is more profound in that these systems may replicate existing biases and indeed may entrench the power of elites in a way, sometimes even subconsciously. It may not be a conscious decision, but just reflecting the way that society is today, those will continue to perpetuate various forms of discrimination. That's your concern that you're highlighting, am I right? Do you have an idea on how to combat that more difficult problem?
Right, so I think in that setting, we will need some external incentives for organizations to be incentivized to examine their systems and ensure that they're not engaging in inadvertent discrimination. So this is somewhat akin to think about discrimination in the traditional world, or even the way discrimination is dealt with in today's world. Employment, for example, to take a concrete example, there are regulations in place which prohibit discrimination based on race and gender and age and a number of other protected factors. And companies can be subjected to external audits. There are regulatory agencies tasked with that charge.
Why wouldn't those existing laws, frameworks, and social norms be sufficient to deal with any discrimination that if my hiring manager or HR department uses AI instead of human judgment and the outcomes are biased, wouldn't the same laws be sufficient? Esther, you wanted to jump in on this point?
Yeah, one reason is because there are other laws that say you cannot hire people who have been convicted of a crime or come out of jail or all these other things. And so to me, one of the most exciting things about AI is that it's actually going to reveal not AI's biases, but our own. But these laws actually discriminate, and they're legal. The challenge—
Your point is that a former convict may actually be the best employee for a job. The AI would find that out, whereas we wouldn't even consider that person.
Or maybe not. So I'll just go back to a little bit of the history.
Sure, please.
Long ago when I was in kindergarten, AI was natural language, which was really completely unnatural. It was expert systems, which were basically logic models. And so AI in itself changes. And so the real question, in a sense, is what is AI in 2030? Now we're caught up with these object recognition and classification models. One challenge is, do you recognize individual objects, or do you recognize different kinds of cats and understand, there's maybe four-legged cats, there are tigers, there are lions, there are adopted cats that belong in the jungle, and they're now in a zoo. Can you recognize them in the wrong places? What we need to go back to some extent is models. And so you want an algorithm that doesn't simply ask, is this an X? Is it an undereducated, bad-tempered employee? Or is it a young child that was mistreated that became that? Is this a cat even though it has only 2 legs because it has cat genetics? Or is it not really a cat because all cats must have 4 legs? And so these models that are generally not in use yet, because we're just, what is a cancer? Is it a kind of cell, or is it a kind of behavior of that cell that eats other cells? There's lots of cancer cells in everybody's body, but because of the immune cells and the macrophages and stuff in people's bodies, they don't have cancer, though you may recognize cancer doing a liquid biopsy. The world is much more complicated. We need to move beyond these both space and time delimited recognition tools to things that model behavior longer term. And then, we keep saying we. Who is we? Is it voters? Is it a government regulatory agency? Is it broad public opinion? In a sense, the challenges of AI are much more what it reveals about us.
I guess
Yes.
I could make a quick comment on this specific question you raised about, are the current laws adequate? So let's take a concrete example, like disparate impact for employment. It's Title VII. And so, for example, if, let's say, a company hires men at a much higher rate than women, then they have to give a justification for why. And if it's a human decision-making process, which is relatively rule-based, then they might point to credentials and say, oh, here's the applicant pool. We really wanted this credential in the job. And look, it just happened to be the case that there was a higher incidence of that credential in the pool of male applicants relative to the pool of female applicants. And so then that becomes a business necessity defense. Now, if instead we have this complicated machine learning system, AI system, as a key component of the decision support for hiring, then and that system exhibits a similar behavior, that men are hired at a higher rate than women, then to be able to answer the question of why that arose requires us to identify what were the important factors behind decisions. And that's a non-trivial question,
right,
because it's a very complex model, and we are beginning to see technology of that form now emerge, and there's some work from my group at Carnegie Mellon. There are a bunch of other groups across the country and the world that are starting to work on these kind of concrete questions of identifying important factors behind decisions of AI systems.
This is getting towards so-called algorithmic accountability.
This gets towards algorithmic accountability,
But would it be a group of gurus like you who interrogate the algorithm, or would it be another algorithm that would do it?
Right.
And who would interrogate your algorithm?
Right. So yes, so it'll be an algorithmic system that is carefully crafted that'll probe the system under study with carefully crafted inputs to, for example, see if we have 2 applicants who are identical except in their gender, would the system treat them similarly? That's oversimplifying things a little bit, but just to give you a sense of what this kind of technology looks like. But it's not as straightforward as that, because it's very easy to just never use features like gender or age or race directly in these systems. You just never supply them. Does this mean the system becomes fair by definition? Unfortunately, it's not that trivial, because there could be other things that when combined encode information about gender or race.
Sure.
So zip code encodes race, perhaps, maybe some combination of the job experience encodes, or maybe periods of leave that are indicative of a woman taking time off during pregnancy might
Right.
reveal information about gender. So there are proxies
Yeah.
for these protected information types. And that makes the problem considerably harder, because how those proxies are internally represented inside, say, a deep neural network, it's a non-trivial question.
But again, I mean, those things are real. And so what you really want to understand is, well, how come fewer women got this particular degree? And maybe that algorithm goes back to professors who didn't recognize the value of their female students. Or maybe it goes back to the mothers of those female students who said, honey, whatever you do, I want you to find a nice guy. This degree doesn't really matter. And so
Sure.
it's really complicated.
I mean, what you say is so profound, right? That, you're talking about the root causes, the pipeline problem, and so on. These are reflective of societies and choices that have built up over time. And that gets to a question about AI. Are we asking too much of AI? I mean, is AI transformational in the sense that we're talking about, not just of business, but of a lot of things in society? Will it expose, challenge, force us to confront a lot of these issues? Or is AI just another tool? In other words, a great tool, but another tool, and by 2030, we'll be talking about it as a ubiquitous tool in our toolkit. I'm curious to know what you think.
I certainly would agree with that, that for me it is a tool.
Then maybe it's asking too much to ask it to transform all of society.
Especially because, if you think of AI in any intelligence, you educate an intelligence. There's that raw capacity, but then it's only as good and effective or ethical or moral as the training that you apply it. So when we're training these models, today we train them with labeled data. We say, that's a cat, and you show it the picture of the cat. You say, that's a dog, you show it the picture of the dog, and you repeat this 1 billion times. Now you actually today, to your algorithmic accountability, we don't actually know what the algorithm is extracting out of those images that's associating with that label, and that's why they can be fooled. And you can sometimes, I'm sure you've seen these pictures where it just looks to you like a TV with old-fashioned TV with turned to a station that's not there. It just looks like noise. But the AI system will tell you, no, that's a cat. And you can't actually know what was it about that particular set of noise that extracted those features that it associated. But I think it's probably unfair to assume that if there is systemic bias in a social system, that somehow we will craft these intelligences that will somehow transcend our own challenges and our own biases. I think that's probably asking too much. And I always say use the right tool for the right job. And perhaps if you want to cure systemic bias and you only have a system that is as good as its training, then that's going to be really hard unless you consciously ask yourself continuously. And certainly this is what we have to do for ourselves. We have to say, I acknowledge I have biases. I may not be able to articulate them, but if I assume that they're there, if I'm always questioning, then that's that first step towards perhaps curing some of that. I think the same thing has to do with these systems. We are training them. They're not programmed. It's not this series of endless what-ifs. And sometimes we think, well, if I'm not explicitly doing something, then perhaps then the bad outcome won't occur. But no, you're training all of these models. They're only as good as the input that they have, and they will always produce an output, which is another form of bias. It's said to do this, I'm going to do it.
Right.
And that's something perhaps we're trusting too much. But I do think it's too much to ask these systems to transcend our own biases. And if we can't articulate them, then they will be passed unarticulated into these systems.
We could even go perhaps a step further. The last few years I was based in China for our publication as our China business editor. And we've seen the way that AI is being utilized in China to reflect the norms of the party. And to reinforce control, whether it's facial recognition or one of the multiple ways of social scoring. And there's numerous things that are bringing lots of benefits to many Chinese people, It's broadly accepted in China, but at the same time is clearly reflecting a set of values and cultural norms that are quite different from those in many Western societies. So might we see that sort of evolution of this technology, again, as a tool of those who happen to have power in different societies?
And it's an incredibly effective tool. We've already, think of the news headlines over the last couple of weeks here. For me, the science fiction trope that you mentioned, Stephen Hawking, that you'll have this goal-oriented consciousness that and usually the trope is that somehow it emerges by itself. We didn't create it, but somehow it's kind of the Skynet model, right? That somehow you'll have this thing and this goal-seeking system that has access to this resources will somehow connect up in a gestalt with this other one, and that's when it runs away from us. I don't necessarily worry too much about that. For me, the clear and present danger is my lack of apparent free will, because we have very good statistical models of behavior, and those aren't just used to predict behavior, they're used to change behavior and modify behavior. So these are very powerful tools. Now, they're only as powerful, again, as the data that flows into them. So I think this is a question of data sovereignty. How much of my information am I retaining, and how much am I giving away? Every time you click on something, what did you just give away? Every time you do one of those personality tests, how much information about myself did I just give to someone? And it's a consideration. Did I get something of meaning in return, or did I just find out which Hogwarts house I should belong to? And so it's just that question we always have to be asking ourselves. And perhaps that's also the opportunity here is, as we retain data sovereignty, as we retain more of our personal information and decide which economic activity is beneficial for us to enter into, that could be a way that we retain a little bit more control. But we just always have to be thoughtful.
I'm going to ask another question of the panelists, that is, what do you see as the principal challenge in the road to, let's say, 2030, to seeing some of the hopes realized? We can just maybe start with Esther. Looking ahead, what do you see as the principal challenge to overcome?
Okay, well, again, it's whose hopes?
Your hopes.
Yeah, I mean, my hopes are that AI will become extremely useful doing stuff that we understand it does. And frankly...
What stands in the way?
But my other hope, which is far more, because I think that's going to happen one way or another.
Really, you think there's...
These guys are working on it. It's going pretty well. The challenge is more, again, it's not up to AI to fix the problems. It is up to us. And it's up to us to use the information revealed by the AI, not that you have diabetes, but what are the circumstances that led to you having diabetes, including companies using a knowledge of your behavior and your reactions to get you to make decisions short term that you regret long term. There's not just a difference between AI and you, but there's a difference between the short term you and the long term you. And machines are getting much, much better using AI at appealing to the short term decision making capacities that make people buy stuff they don't need, that make people select things that are priced high, whatever. I know I don't want to go into a rant, but
that's okay. No, we have seen the enemy is us.
The challenge is giving
Let's go to a question from the floor, yeah.
The challenge is giving people tools to manipulate themselves rather than simply giving governments and businesses tools to manipulate people.
I see, the bottom up, as it were.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, please identify yourself and your affiliation.
Brian Blauschild, The Questions, Famous Enterprises. We're a distribution company. And my question's for Kirk. You mentioned the ubiquity of email. One reason I use email, it's easy for me to use. We'd love to use AI in our business, but the challenge would be we'd have to partner with consultants or somebody in academia to help us. Will AI ever reach a point where it'll be so easy to use that we could do it ourselves?
And I think the answer to that is yes, and I'll give you an example. A friend of mine is one of our support engineers in Hong Kong, and so dozens of times a day he gets the email, he gets the phone call, and occasionally some of those customers are having challenges. Those things go nuclear. They get escalated up, and what he did is he used an open source framework. He used the information that he gets every day, and he trained up his own model to sit there and be that filter, to be that little imp that sits on his shoulder And when he's looking at all of those things that are coming every day, when one of those is going to be, has a good chance of being escalated very quickly, he gets that alert. So he has created this system by himself with open source tools, and it's just enough for him to make his job better. So he will, every time he gets all those alerts, he can say, oh, you know what? This one, I better prioritize my next 10 minutes because this one probably has a good chance of being escalated very quickly. And I want to satisfy the customer. I want to get them the right solution as quickly as possible. And if this is one that's going to be a problem, then I want to know it. And so those are those kinds of tools, and he put all this together himself. So the actual tools are out there. They're becoming more accessible. They're becoming more available. But it does point, I think, to the larger opportunity for industry is don't assume that you're immune. That there is probably someone, it might be one of your competitors, it might be someone sitting at a Starbucks right now who is looking at your industry and says, you know what, I bet if I applied this tool to that data, I can get a fantastic outcome and really be able to turn the tables on entrenched competitors. So I would encourage everyone, think about the data, think about these tools, because they are available now and people are playing with them right now and getting really interesting results.
Esther?
So really briefly, and just out of curiosity, did he have the tool monitor his behavior for 2 weeks and recognize this? Or did he say size of customer, sentiment expressed in email, which products? Was it an explicit set of instructions and criteria, or was it just pattern recognition?
So what he was doing was feature extraction from text and sentiment analysis. So, and also correlating with the behavior. So what happened? So he was labeling his own data, right? But in a sense, it was labeled for him, because here's an incoming email, and this one was able to resolve without being escalated quickly. Here's another one. This one went right to our CEO in 10 minutes and got, so that went away. So taking that data and then doing the feature analysis on just the text, that's what he was able to do. He was able to construct this tool for himself. So in the sense, it's saying over time, he would have gathered that experience himself, but this was one thing, is he was able to quickly create this system.
And automate.
And now he can proliferate it, right? So everyone can have that expert advice. And I think that's another one of these tools, is being able to have that capture of that expert. Instead of having the what ifs and trying to elucidate in an expert system, just have the data present itself and try and create that expertise and then proliferate it.
It's one of the first sayings I learned when I joined The Economist many moons ago as a business journalist was, if only Siemens knew what Siemens knows. It sounds like your colleague has found a way to know what he already knows, just more efficiently. Yes, a question in the back. Again, please identify yourself, sir.
Hi, John Scuderi from the Travelers Insurance Companies. I was just curious if you see a place over the intermediate to long term where the technology gets so advanced that we kind of throw our hands up and say, I'm a fallible human being with bias, and so I'd like the machine to kind of take over and begin to make decisions. And if that's true, I was wondering if you could talk about opportunities and challenges of that.
So, should I?
Sure, please.
I think we have to be really careful here. So, and it's related to something that I wanted to say earlier to our question about are we setting the expectations too high for AI? And I think my answer to that is we are setting the expectations too high, and we should. So we shouldn't treat it like, oh, this is a difficult problem, we'll throw it at this sophisticated neural network, and whatever answer it comes back with, it's going to do a better job, and maybe it has biases, but it's because we are biased, and we leave it at that. That's a very dangerous approach here. So what I would say, and in the insurance sector as well, historically there has been the ability for consumers who feel they have been wrong to contest decisions. And the way this industry has handled it is that you know how you're making decisions, so you can answer those questions. That requirement should persist, even when you move towards more advanced AI. The same with credit decisioning in the financial sector. We are seeing an emergence of adoption of these kinds of technologies there. And the reason I say that we should set the expectations high here is that the consequences of not doing it is really, really high. So it's not like isolated, biased people in a few companies that are making decisions for because they individually have these biases. These large-scale systems can reinforce and amplify these biases and make it really systemic if they go understudied. But there's also an opportunity here because unlike humans who might be biased for different reasons, and it's hard to understand, it's hard to study them, we actually can probe these systems. So there's an opportunity here to really understand well why these systems are behaving the way they are. And then it might reveal that they were biased because of the bias, a particular form of bias on the data on which they were trained. And maybe there's a way to rectify it by augmenting the data set, by collecting additional data of a certain form, or by taking the existing data and adding sort of counterfactuals, which are matched pairs with, let's say, identical other characteristics, but the gender is different or something else is different, and then retraining the system so that they might perform equally well in terms of their predictive capabilities, but then the unfairness goes down. So I think that's one thing, and it goes back to a comment that.
Let's keep it there. Esther, a quick comment?
Yeah, I wanted
Just in the interest of time, yeah.
I want to address this in a different context that's really timely. The Uber self-driving car that crashed into somebody and the woman died 2 days ago.
In Arizona, yeah.
In Arizona, in Tempe. So, it's not just bias, it's other stuff. And driving cars is an extremely complex activity. Millions of people die in car accidents. It's many times even juries can't figure out, quote, who was guilty. So it's complicated. I come to this with a unique perspective. I don't know how to drive. I'm a New Yorker. And so most of you think about AI versus your own driving skills, which are pretty much perfect. And so you're appalled when a self-driven car kills somebody. I come at it at the perspective of someone who watches people drive, and they terrify me. They talk, they text, they look at the sunset.
They eat hamburgers.
Yeah, eat hamburgers, they don't sleep enough. And so the challenge is not letting anecdotes like one car killed one person drive our decisions, but rather looking at the statistics. And as someone who has a less biased view of cars versus people, I'd pick the cars anytime. The only challenge here, and this is the most interesting one, it's also a social, political, economic one, is all the cars need to follow the same rules because then they can predict the behavior of the other cars. The problem here is the pedestrians who don't always follow the rules.
Yeah. What I wanted to follow up with the time that we have. There's one sort of danger that Stephen Hawking outlined, the malicious AI worry. But is there another kind of concern that might be more imminent? And that is, rather than AI being like, let's say, electricity or the arrival of modern machine tools on the shop floor, things that were transformative and over time spread in a democratic way across many kinds of companies and industries. We already have concerns about the power of the technology companies, concentration. America particularly has seen industrial concentration is a problem that The Economist has written about numerous times, and we've argued that there is a stronger case for antitrust scrutiny and so on in America, especially of the technology companies. And the lead that is being amassed by a handful of companies is quite strong. Is it possible that this could be a greater threat, that rather than becoming that all-purpose tool that is widely distributed and we need to worry about societal impacts, that it is entrenched in the handful of companies that become more and more powerful and perhaps less transparent than society would like? Welcome, a brief comment from each of you.
So I think that I'll come back to the data because intelligence craves data. And if you have control over the data, then you have control over the intelligences, whether they are human or artificial.
Sure.
And I think that's perhaps the greatest opportunity here. I actually think that if this can be democratized, this can be made ubiquitous globally and justly. But for me, it's going to come back to the question of the data that flows into these systems. And the reason the models can be so sophisticated is that we today are giving more and more data to fewer and fewer companies who are amassing that.
We as individuals, as consumers,
individuals,
are yielding our data.
And I think that's the question of data sovereignty and data privacy can be that way in which we reclaim that ability to have that be more justly distributed. I think the other piece of this is that right now, all that data is literally in data centers. We talk about them, enabled that. We've centered the data. In very short order, we would expect that more and more of the data will live its entire life cycle out in the things,
right,
out on the intelligent edge. And that's an opportunity for us to regain more control in these more distributed systems.
A quick comment on this?
So I think I want to touch on your transparency point and associated accountability. And that's going to be hugely important, and we're seeing that with some of the recent examinations from comments on Facebook and what happened there with Cambridge Analytica. Democratizing AI is something that a lot of companies are working on, and I think that's inevitable. Machine learning is a service where even if you don't have the expertise in-house, you can just provide the data and then others can build models for you. I think that's going to happen. The data asymmetry is going to mean that some companies will continue to be dominant in certain areas. But there's also movement to provide access to certain kinds of data to lots of entities. So government data, for example,
right,
for smart city planning and so forth.
So you're more relaxed about this. You're not worried about the hegemony of the big tech companies in AI, it sounds like.
I am concerned about its implications for fairness,
right,
and its implications for privacy and some of these other like
sure, which you've touched on before.
Right.
Okay. Esther, last word to you briefly.
Fundamentally, it's the difference between our individual behavior and our collective will. It's not a question of, quote, democratizing AI. It's a question of allocating power and deciding as a society how we want to do that and whether we want to impose antitrust on companies that have too much power. But I'd still rather have a company have power than have a government have too much power. So it's complicated.
All right. You heard it here, folks. It's complicated. But we did have a nuanced tour of the horizon with our three great experts.